Well, a very warm welcome. I hope you enjoy this presentation. It was recorded in October 2022 in Las Vegas at the Security Congress. Enjoy.
But thank you for coming. So there's only three reasons you're here. You're either really love risk management, you're looking for a quiet place to do emails. Thanks. Don't feel bad, I may have done that myself. Or you actually desperately have to know about risk assessment and risk management. So I thought, well, why not have a talk about it? And I said, I would love to talk about enterprise security risk assessment. Can I have 3 hours? And they went, no, we can give you an hour. And I said, okay, I can do something with that. So traditionally, risk assessment has worked around two strategies. Anybody here use the Wagner method? Yep, show of hands. Wagner method, or the Bogsat method. Anybody know the Bogsat method? No, okay, so that's traditional risk assessment. And my favourite is personally is the Wagner method. A wild-ass guess, not easily refutable. I've relied on that for a few years. I'm sure we all have at different times. What can you say? We're trying to move away from that, so there's a little bit about what I wanted to do. We've all used Excel and we love Excel. You know, if I could only pick one piece of software, it would be Excel. Fortunately, I don't have to because it's not that good. Risk assessments, risk matrices and what have you, there are some better ways because that ends up still with a similar sort of process of what do you want to do. This is a model that I built a while ago because people keep saying to me, in fact, I may have been guilty of this at some point, risk assessment's too complicated. You know, why do we have to do this? And so I sort of looked at this model and said, okay, the bit we're talking about today is this bit up in the top right-hand corner there, enterprise security risk assessment with more than one person typically, or often a team of a few people, at least a lot of stakeholders involved, can take you weeks or typically it takes me months, quite frankly. Not that they're actually that hard, but getting all the stakeholders in one room is quite difficult and getting them to agree. I'm not going to talk about anything in the middle, but I do want to share with you my favourite form of risk assessment, much like Wagner, which is the take-two method. And that's basically take 2 minutes and think about that email to your boss before you press the send button. Ask a friend, if you want to take 2 minutes. But that's kind of the whole spectrum in my mind of where we're trying to do risk assessment. We try to come along with a sledgehammer and crack a walnut, right? And it doesn't work when you're using the wrong tool for the job. So today the focus is really on that enterprise security risk assessment. So that's enough about me. Let's talk about me for a while. As you can tell, I write books, and I'll come to those in a moment. But I first did my first enterprise security risk assessment in the era that I like to think of as having hair. Those of you who know it as last century. It was for a little company in Australia called Woodside Energy Limited, which, has anybody heard of Woodside? I'm guessing not. Okay, so Australia's largest natural resources project, $24 billion with a gas plant, 3 offshore rigs, supply-based tankers, and that's kind of Australia for you. No one's ever heard of us. But when I was invited to do that having previously run security at the gas plant, and so they said, for my sins, can you come back and do an enterprise security risk assessment? Me being me, he said, sure, I can do that. And at the time, we had an Australian standard. Now it's the ISO 31000 standard. And they said, we want you to do it with this. And I went, well, that's like, there's only 20 pages of text in this thing. How can you have one risk management standard that addresses everything? We're not doing, security is ultimately different from finance, right? It's different from legal risk, it's different from safety, it's got all those other variables of risk. We actually have active adaptive adversaries, like the 3As, trying to take us down. Everything we do, they're doing something else. And they're not trying to outcompete us by selling more product and maybe incidentally cause us harm. They're trying to actually do bad stuff to us. So I put my reservations aside and picked up the Australian standard, and it actually worked because it was so short. It let you think about an apples for apples. And one of the things I found in later years, I presented to a conference in Washington shortly after 9/11, and I was talking about the international standard at the time, as it had become. And I saw some great presentations. I remember the Coast Guard doing a presentation about the Port of LA, looking at how they protect tankers and critical infrastructure there. And then another presentation shortly after that where the New York Port Authority had done something else. And they were great models, they were great risk assessments. But you know, if you were Homeland Security or the President or anybody with a budget, it didn't tell you where the apples for apples were. How do I put my money? You know, is it more important? Is the risk? There was no comparability between protecting a tanker in New York or a tanker in Los Angeles. So this was the nice thing about using the Australian, now the international standard, which is why I stick with that. And so that's one takeaway I took from that very first job. The other one was interesting. Me being, as I said, in the era of hair, was going into an engineering environment and saying, I'm here to do a security risk assessment. And they're like, oh yeah, okay, I get it, it's important. But you know, we do engineering, we're production things, so don't tell me about terrorists, and this is before 9/11, right? So don't tell me about terrorists and this sort of stuff. And I'm like, I'm interviewing people who are polite and they're friendly, they sort of want to do the best thing, but you can see it's all like, yeah, okay, I've got to give you some time and what have you. And then, as part of that process of the interview, I spoke to the environmental guys, and they said, I think we understand your problem. We had the same problem when we were trying to do this, and eventually we figured out that this is an engineering company. Okay, no surprise. And they pulled out their environmental risk assessment, and they said, use this. It's a bow tie method was the process, and it's called the Environmental Hazard Register. So I basically wrote an enterprise security risk assessment titled Security Hazard Register. And as soon as I did that and I put it in that language, the template, they went, right, I get it, I can work with this now, I love it, it's great. So that was the other big takeaway from me, was to say, whatever the language is, it doesn't matter what you call it, it doesn't matter, as long as the organisation goes, yes, I understand it. You know, if you walk into a bank and you talk about terrorism risk to someone who's basically running a managed fund or looking at the markets and testing in markets each day, you probably want to be talking quantitative and numbers and Monte Carlo and all this sort of stuff. But that's a whole different space. So that was kind of my entry into this. And since then I've done our Department of Defence, Department of Finance, Agriculture, Australia Antarctic Division. I've done mines in Africa and Indonesia. You know, I've done a whole range of enterprise security risk assessments. And they're probably my bread and butter now. I love doing those. I've done a couple for the UN. I've done this sort of stuff that it's really interesting work, and I'm a nosy sort of fellow anyway. Along the way, I've sort of started and stopped a few businesses. I've started about 20 businesses, it turns out. Most of them went nowhere. Some of them failed spectacularly. Not that spectacular, you haven't heard of them. But one of them actually we took from a coffee shop, basically a red wine drinking club, if you want to be honest, to the Australian Stock Exchange. So that's left me in a position now where what I do is I consult and I train and I write books, and I basically want to get the word out just to increase the profession and the professionalism. To get the word out without, you know, well, I like to make money. Money's good. That's one of the reasons I invest in 20 odd startups and what have you, and you can see a couple of them there, Sectara and SRM. The whole thing though is if people get something for free, they don't value it. Now that being said, that's free. So I've written 5 books. I can't give you the big one, the Security Risk Management Body of Knowledge, because we put it with Wiley's. But for today, and Amazon only let me do it 5 days a year, I can make the books free. So today is one of those days. There's a book there on business cases, basically how to get the money for the funding that you want. A book on benchmarking, how to find out how you're doing, and some basic templates and guidance. There's a book there for those of you, or maybe people you know who've come from a tech background and suddenly become team leader. That's basically the supervisor's handbook, all the things I wish I had known at the time when they sort of, here you are, Talbot, you can run this team. And there's a book there called the Security Risk Management, a Memoir. That's what this looks like. This is basically every security risk model known to human beings. Lots of colour and diagrams. And it's the sort of thing you can pull out in front of the client. You can say, oh, this is a bow tie, or this is, or you can get a bit of a heads up around maybe how to do context analysis or what have you. Now, if you go to that, you'll also find some free software, because one of the things, you'll find a link where you can download a free template for Excel. For those of you who want to use template Excel, it's pretty good. It's been built over the years. and that's on my juliantalbot.com website. We built this Sectara software, and it's not the best we can make it because that's version 2, it's not out yet. But everybody who sees it loves it. Try it, there's a free plan, everything works. As I said, I want to get this stuff out as much as possible, so give it a crack, ask us for a demo. The process I'm going to show you today is basically what we baked into it. So you could do this thing automated, rigorous, structured, and you could press a button and download a report in a whole lot less time than it takes you to do. So, and there's also some training there and some stuff, and the training is free if you buy actually it's free training anyway, but there's heaps more training, including in Phoenix next week. I'll say if you buy a free plan, that's great, but the free plan is like a fraction of what the training is, so it's actually pretty much next to nix. So I don't want to say this is free so it's not worth anything, but it's free so it's worth something, so take it away and have a play with it. Send it to all your friends because they might be able to use it. Now the other thing, before I move on to the actual meat of it, is when I was a young fella, my mum used to say to me, you should never talk about, the 3 things you don't talk about with strangers. Religion and politics. Like I'm in the States, what could go wrong? Let's talk about religion and politics. And she said, you should never debate the merits of e-books versus paper books with people. So I take my mum's advice to heart, and I clearly think that e-books are much better than paper books. But I will, that being said, for anybody here who prefers paper books over e-books? Luddites, we're in a tech, come on, this is so scary. No, my wife's the same, so I can't judge too much. But I brought these 2 along because, I don't know, it's just something, got a bit of thunk factor, right? I could do that with my iPhone, I suppose. So the first 2 people to ask a question, doesn't even have to be a good question, ask me how tall I am, which motorbikes I like, okay? Can come up, and the first one gets the choice of whichever book they'd like, the second one gets the choice of which book's left. Now there's only one catch, so you've got to do it at the end of the presentation when the question time, and they say 2 catches, so you've got to actually come up and collect it at the time. So, if this was a normal IT conference, it'd be full of introverts, and that would be like a terrible thing to do. Do we all know how to tell an introverted or an extroverted IT programmer from an introvert? The extrovert looks at your shoes. So that's the catch. So you have to actually be extroverted enough to come forward and have a chat about it. So why enterprise security risk assessment? Well, it's a good idea. That's the first one. One of the ones I did was for the Australian Trade Commission, and that was 60 nations, 200 different offices. Actually, Australia's most diverse or geographically, not the biggest international network, that was DFAT, but they have embassies the size of this building sort of thing. But doing the enterprise security risk assessment for that opened my eyes to a whole different way of looking at things. And so we couldn't literally or even virtually go to all of the locations. You just couldn't physically go there. It's like trying to map a network. And it's one of my favourite questions when I do this. I ask people, so do you have a good network map? And there's only really 2 answers to that. And sometimes I find an organisation that's medium sized and not too big, and they've actually, in one location, they go, yep, we've got a network map, and we've got software that tracks it, and I can press a button and lay it out for you. But I never ever, to this day, have found a large organisation that hand on heart can say, yep, I know what my network map looks like. Because they change, these things are just too complicated and going all the time. So you can't even get to the locations, because as soon as you do, some buggers come to a conference and they put in a jolly a router here, which they're now connected to your network without you knowing it. We've spoken about IoT and a few other topics there. So I'm not going to hammer this point, maybe a little bit. There's one aspect of the IoT that we really haven't even touched on yet, and that's the numbers, right? They're big numbers, we all get it. But I want to put this in a real practical term. In about the end of this century, the experts tell us we will have about 10 billion people on the planet. They tell us it's going to cap out at that because, I don't know, suddenly we're going to stop having kids or something, but that's the theory, okay? So 10 billion people who buy 10,000 things a year So if you think about that, a couple of hundred things a week, 30 items a day, they do that for 10,000 years. Now, I'm happy to be around long enough to do that personally, but I don't think it will be any of us in this room actually there. But I just wanted you to think about that. 10 billion people buying 10,000 things a year for 10,000 years. That's 18 zeros, right? That's not even touching the number of zeros on there. That's like 36 zeros, which is not half. That's like 18 zeros more. So the Internet of Things isn't just connecting fish tanks and fridges and toasters. You can connect your coffee cup. Potentially you could have a takeaway coffee cup every single day, 5 times a day with a unique IP number, right? Your shoes will have an individual IP addresses. So, when we think about all this sort of connectivity, and we think Internet of Things is not about toasters, every single thing on that street, that very Blade Runner-esque street. And when we do a risk assessment, we think, okay, well, I've got a good understanding of my risk. Well, maybe, but the enterprise is very, very wide and different from what we know it as today. And this is just, genetics, nanotechnology, robotics, AI, everything is coming together. As Ray Kurzweil says, the singularity is near. It's potentially, well, probably in our lifetimes, this idea of this man-machine interface connectivity. My view, this is the old sort of model of security. When you think about physical, personnel, information and ICT, and I've seen models where information includes ICT, and I'm not a huge fan of that model because there's information in your head, there's information on paper, it's not all ICT. But when I look at this and I think, okay, for me, cyber looks like this. There's nothing that doesn't touch at some point. So when I look at the definition of cybersecurity as different from ICT or as different from information, because imagine you use some sort of an insider breach for a network of driverless cars. The things you can do if you have the information or the code, if you've got access to it, they start to manifest real world physical events. The boundary's just not what it used to be, and it never will be again. So how do we kind of frame that is the first big question. Now, this is what an enterprise security risk assessment often looks like. As I said, East Coast versus West Coast, apples for apples, your company versus my company. Fill in the blanks. But what we really need is something where you can do some sort of comparison, because when you're actually going for funding and you're looking at it and you want to cascade this down, because you don't just stop at an enterprise security risk assessment, there are other elements you need to think about, maybe a geographical site, maybe a particular aspect of the network, a particular platform. And in this context, what we're trying to do is, and we often forget, risk management isn't there for its own sake. We're trying to manage the future. We're trying to manage uncertainty. We're trying to create a future that we want to be part of. Not a bad spot for a holiday, is it? You've probably heard of the Swiss cheese model, the bow tie model, all these sort of things. So this is my contribution to it. This is the rock pool of risk. This is the rock pool model, and this is the way I think about enterprise security risk assessment. Because trying to explain it to people, they'd say, okay, well, we need to go everywhere and do a risk assessment of everything, and then we glue it all together and that becomes an enterprise risk assessment. Like, no, you really can't do that. Doing that is saying, I've got a portfolio of 20 houses and I'm going to go and inspect them all and get a long list of things to do, and that makes me a long list. And you say, well, that's one way to do it. But really, each house has got a door. Each house has got windows. You need to think about maybe where they are in a high crime area or a low crime area. You need to think about the portfolio of houses you're trying to protect. Because if you lose one house, maybe that matters, maybe it's a critical asset, maybe it's not. If you lose two, what counts, which one is most important? But you do know all of them need a solid core door on the front door. All of them need window locks. So you can build a framework and you can assess against that. And in the rock pool model, you're thinking about taking a walk through that beautiful spot there. And there are spots there where you can stand on a bit of high sand. That's a low risk area. There's other spots where you're going to put your foot into a hole and there'll be something sharp, or you'll break an ankle. What we're trying to do with enterprise risk is take the helicopter view and level that out. So there's two ways you can do this. You can just dump a truckload of sand, right? You just level it, there's a nice flat surface, low risk, no problem. Two problems: hugely expensive, overkill for most things. Secondly, the tides of change are going to wash that sand back out. the environment changes, technology changes, and as the currents come in and out. So what we're trying to do is think about, if you look at your portfolio, and I'm going to stretch this, whether you're thinking about cyber in the sense of your network assets, but I'd like you to think more broadly about everything in the enterprise. Because there's the physical aspects, and I did an enterprise security risk assessment for a really interesting department recently in Australia, and they had a great IT program that they were rolling out. Clunky network, they were integrating a couple of, but the program was great. It's only a couple, I really couldn't even improve upon what they were doing. I said, just do that, put more resources at that point, you'll be great. And then I went and had a look at the physical side of it, and basically they had servers sitting in unlocked racks behind a window on a street. There was one classic one where you could have gone to Amazon and bought a USB drive and a lockpick kit, for that matter. It wasn't exactly a hard lock to pick, it was, and then gone to the dark web, download a bit of malware, plugged in, and owned that entire network progressively. So you really need to think about all that inside a threat and put this all together and think, okay, so if I'm looking at this rock pool model, where are the holes? Is it because I'm operating in, I've got an office in Russia? Is it because I don't have an insider threat program, or because I've got high staff turnover? Can I move something from here, assets that are existing on the high ground, can I just roll that rock into that hole and cover it? So that's kind of the way of thinking about, when I think about an enterprise, I'm not trying to pick any particular point, trying to understand what the highs and lows are and how to level them out. Now, there's a couple of aspects to this model. First of all, when you're thinking about it, and I'll give you a really practical example from a previous organisation. We had, in terms of high ground, we had outstanding racks. Basically we manage our traffic and our networks, and the protection was brilliant. We had the monitoring going on, what have you. And then in a couple of our offices over in, well, I may as well say it's a country northeast of Australia, very large, currently having problems with the Uyghurs, right? So we had a couple of offices in there where people would go in, and in the best intentions, they would basically buy an off-the-shelf domestic grade router, essentially, like a good domestic router, and they'd plug in there, and that would be our network. And I'm going, we've got routers sitting over here in the storeroom we haven't even used yet. This is the high ground here. Let's take one of those routers and go plug it in over there and fix that problem. So it's thinking about not just what you can do, but how you use what you've got to fill the gaps right now by reallocating. This is one model that grew out of this, an evolved version of the security risk management body of knowledge, which, by the way, was a book a friend and I, Miles Jakeman, put together back in 2008, then 2009, with about 150 specialists. We're about to republish it next year, and not with Wiley, so we'll actually be able to make that free as part of a Kindle download every now and again, and a whole lot of other things. But this is the updated version, and by the way, through that QR code, you can access all of these slides to download. There's the Security Risk Management Aid Memoir has basically got them. Don't reinvent the wheel, please. I've seen people take something, change it a little bit, so I'm not breaching copyright. There's no copyright. Knock your socks off. It's good. But this model is really looking at this idea that what we're really ultimately about is objectives. It's not about being secure for the sake of being secure. And I won't go too much on this because there's a whole lot behind this, but the concept is that if you start with practitioners, so you start with people who are working in insider threat and personnel, people who are working, whether it's in technical sides or management, people physical security. They all come from some sort of practice area designed to build on the knowledge areas, to have the knowledge they need, the competency they need to generate some sort of a secure environment, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, for objectives. Now that model is designed to integrate with almost every management system. So the top one there, activity areas, intelligence, security, response, recovery, matches with the PPRR model, some of you may have heard of, so prevention, preparation, response, recovery, all these kind of things designed to connect in. So when I'm thinking about security and enterprise, that includes the enablers there at the bottom, which are a foundation, regulation, training, industry bodies, certifications, ISC2. But how many people here have used ISO 31000? Okay, how many people here have not used ISO 31000? Excellent, or not. So let me briefly tell you about ISO 31000. International Standards Organisation. It grew out of the Australian and British, and then it became an international standard, which By the way, you guys actually have adopted, so ANSI, the National Standards Institute, has accepted ISO 31000 and endorsed it. About 149 other nations have as well. So it's probably one of the places I go to as a foundation for a generic process. It's literally, in terms of the meat of it, it's 15 pages long. And it's worth finding out about, because the thing I like, it's not perfect, okay? There's no perfect standard. But the nice thing about it is if you work with an ISO 31000 company, and it's basically mandated in Australia, I won't say by law, but it's mandated by government and it's mandated in a whole range of areas. So if I go and work in organisation A, and then I go and work in organisation B, I know they're going to follow exactly the same process. I know they're going to have the same definitions. I know they're going to think about risk in the same way. And so the process in the middle there, now the three you can see around the outside there, monitor and report, review, communicate and consult, they're continuous processes, so I'm not really going to touch those. They're things they're good ideas, right? We should do this. So the bit in the middle looks at saying scope, context, criteria. Now, the second biggest problem I see with most risk assessments is the scope, context and criteria, the lack of, as in, let's just do a risk assessment, but we won't worry about scoping it or talking about why we're doing it. I'm not going to talk about that today, just to see you. I will talk about, in passing, the biggest problem I see. And this is essentially taking that model, putting it into more of a security framework where you think about, threats and what have you. This big scary diagram, if it doesn't scare you, it probably should, because there's a lot in there. This is the original from the Security Risk Management Body of Knowledge. And I'm going to drill down into that because it's a really good, rigorous process. Now, we've changed that, and while you're busy getting used to that, I'm just going to change it again for you. This is the simple version of it. Now, on the left, you can basically see, on the left over there, you can see the process from the centre of ISO 31000. So scope, context, criteria, identify, analyse, evaluate, treat. On the far right, there's the monitor, review, communicate, consult. So what happens basically is you think about, in a security context, we want to think about the threats, we want to think about the vulnerabilities, and we think about our assets. So whatever you call that, business impact analysis, criticality assessment, take your pick, it's the same thing in this context. So I'm going to drill into that in a moment because this is one of the, again, the slightly newer version, but the nice thing about this model, because we sat down with a lot of people and I'm about to run some workshops next year to do, so if you use the contact form on that QR code, you'll automatically go on my list to, as long as you don't uncheck it, you'll go on the list and I'll tell you about these workshops because I would love to have your participation in it because risk in America, someone asked me at a conference just after 9/11 and said, so what do you think about risk in America? I think it's great. There's lots of it. No, seriously, there's lots of risk assessment is done so well. It's done badly here as it is anywhere, but it's also done so well in so many other areas. But the problem is you've basically got 342 flavours of ice cream. We've got essentially 3 or 4. We do 31,000 in a quantitative, semi-quantitative, and then we have the Monte Carlo and what have you in the statistical. So what we did with this is we put in every single model we could find. So whether that was, the Swiss cheese, the hierarchy of controls, Octave, Carver, all of those things are represented in there with one word or more. So whatever model you use, you can plug into that and play with it. Now, if I talk about threat, we all know this intent and capability idea, and we put it on a matrix quite often, and we sort of decide whether to panic or not based on this matrix. When you drill into it though, there's a slightly more complex element going on. So what we're trying to think about is what constitutes intent and what constitutes capability. So these are sort of the attributes, if you like, the hazard attributes, and saying, well, we've got a situation, do they have the knowledge and resources? So that's the first thing. Actually have any capability to do us harm, or are they just standing on the other side of a river shaking their fist at us? If you think about desire and confidence, they're two characters. Now, I spoke about the sledgehammer to crack a walnut. You can do this on the back of an envelope. You can sit down and have a conversation. And some risk assessments I do aren't that big. This happens in my head. Other risk assessments are big enough that they actually get written down. I'll show you an example of how that looks when you present the report. But each of those, I can start with a table and I can rate them 1 to 5. Is it resources 1 to 5, what have you. But what's really interesting in this model is not just the fact that it's breaking up the various attributes. There's other models I've used that are more complex than that, but this is the best element. Which of those is the most volatile? Now, I'll give it to you. You don't have to raise your hands, or you can have a shout if you want. But resources and knowledge are the biggest. Particularly knowledge. You can have a group, it doesn't matter what they are, terrorist, issue-motivated groups, hackers, same principle. They can have the greatest desire in the world to harm you or to rob you or do whatever. That doesn't change much. It's usually telegraphed well in advance. But the ability, the knowledge to do it can change overnight. One PhD chemist turns a loudmouth issue-motivated group into a viable terrorist threat. One new recruit to a hacker group can change that dynamic overnight. Now, there's lots I could say about this, but I have seen threat assessments where people do ratings from like 0 to 5 and then they multiply things together, which is really scary for me. I don't like that sort of fake numbers to 3 decimal points sort of thing. But if you're using a 0 in there and say this is no threat at all, well, to go from 0 to 3 can make a huge difference overnight. So to go from 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 or whatever your system of numerical is there, if you use numbers at all. And that's kind of understanding what's important about in that space to play with, what's the most volatile. Now I promised I'd give you an example of how I present it. And again, this is for complex sort of work. And this is, in the spreadsheet model that's on my website, you can actually download and it will do this for you. It's got all that text in there via drop downs, and you can modify it and change it. Now, no, this is not a risk assessment, not a threat assessment, sorry. This is just a summary, right? There's a whole, hopefully, from where this model grew was the Department of Defence, and they had like pages of threat assessments behind it. But this is a way to think about how you can present a really robust, defensible case as versus going to the boss and saying, these are bad guys and we need to we need to buy a widget. Presenting it with something that gets more granular gives you a little bit more information. And so we went with each of those. So you see things like Carver model for vulnerability, Octave and what have you, and looking at an interesting element. There's lots of interesting stuff in here, but a couple of elements is when you think about vulnerability, that informs both on the left-hand side, the likelihood, and on the right-hand side, the consequence. So it's not as simple as saying we're vulnerable, because if you are vulnerable, then you introduce an opportunity. And if you're vulnerable, you also make their attack more effective. So there's a couple of dynamics going on there which often get overlooked. And you think about each of these elements. If you really need to do something to the nth degree, it takes time. But you can take, and every one of those words, suitability, you can actually put in some criteria and say, well, what does suitability mean to us? Do we have any ratings for it? Do we need to? Suitability, availability, deployability, very different from a nuclear weapon to a ransomware attack to something you can buy off the shelf. And often that kind of gets lost in this whole thing of, are we vulnerable? Yeah, we've got a vulnerability. We did a pen test to identify these. Well, maybe. Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know if you guys use it here. Our government has a thing called business impact levels, but it's the same thing. Business impact levels, business impact assessment, maximum outage, essentially. How long can you get by without something? And they're the granular aspects. When I think about something, or I have the conversations, when I go to interview people for an enterprise security risk assessment, I'm saying, okay, some of the questions are actually as blunt as that. Where are you vulnerable? Why? What's going on? What are your crown jewels? But some of them are basically framing. Everything I do comes down to this kind of. The other point I'll mention there is the temporal quality. A couple of speakers have alluded to this. Very different during an election, as Kieran said this morning. Equally, if you think about, and the classic is the Olympic Games. It's 10 years in the planning, maybe 5 years in construction, 2 weeks in the running, 4 hours for the closing ceremony. Those timeframes change everything. They change the nature of the threat. They change the likelihood of it happening. A meteorite will strike here one day. One of my favourite quotes from the movie Fight Club is quite simply, on a long enough time frame, everybody's life expectancy falls to 0. And so I see risk assessments which have a likelihood of this happening, and nowhere in there does it actually say, what, next year, next 5 years? There's kind of an assumption. I was called in at one point to, at short notice, to run a risk workshop to help facilitate an update of a risk assessment for a $300 million ICT project. I won't name our Department of Defence because it might embarrass them, but this was in the 10th year of an 8-year project. Okay, so it's a defence project, right? So always. And I came in and I started with their risk list, and nobody could agree. First of all, they had 2-word risk statements like cost overrun. Secondly, no one had actually defined in the 10 years of this project had been running, actually done the risk assessment and said, over what time frame? Is it the life of the project? Is it the life of the year? Is it our next funding cycle? Anyway, so I said, let me go away for a couple of days and come back with a new model, and we worked through it from that approach. But little things change big things. And in this risk management, this is the middle part here of the risk analysis, and thinking about likelihood and consequence, risk ratings, risk prioritisation, what do you do with it? Now, we're all pretty familiar with a bunch of tools, and our favourite is the risk matrix. I've written a lot about risk matrices. There are some really good things about risk matrices, and there's some really bad things about risk matrices, and if you're curious, I got so far down the rabbit hole, I've actually written a book about it, and it just needs an edit to publish. I don't think anybody's ever going to buy a book on risk matrices, right? But so it'll be out there for free. But there's actually a heck of a lot to say. What I do want to say here is it's not the only way of analysing risk. There's any number of ways you can analyse risk, and probably, quite frankly, better ones. But this one has a lot of strengths because we all use it. Everybody understands it. And I have people say to me, mates who are quants, they work for typically in insurance and banks, go, risk matrix give you the wrong results. I'm like, yeah, okay. And so you're going to do a Monte Carlo model when you're talking to a bunch of construction workers trying to explain how to put the scaffolding up. Or as me working with security teams in Africa and saying, a group of people who have grade 4 educations. Now, I'm not saying you guys have grade 4 educations. I actually like the risk matrix and I use it a lot. But it's that ability to communicate which is where it really wins out over a whole lot of other things. I did mention the second biggest or most common failing I see in risk assessments. Now I'm going to mention the most common failing I see in risk assessments, and I alluded to it with that defence one. And there's a model I use which is around, I call it CASE. I make stuff up all the time. This entire presentation is mostly made up. When people would start to talk about risks and you think about, compromise of our information or network breach, you can't address that risk. You can't picture it, and especially when you're trying to do a really large enterprise risk assessment, you need some clarity. So I use this model where a single sentence should say, what's the consequence? What's the asset that we're concerned about? What's the source of the risk? And what's the specific risk event? What is it? Because if you think about compromise of information, that could be anything. That could be the Optus poorly configured API. That could be someone leaving a laptop in the back of a car getting stolen. It could be a staff member inadvertently compromising the information on the website or publishing something or emailing it out. So getting that granularity there means you can rate it. So without having that understanding exactly, in case is the way I do it, because this is one of my top 10 tips, okay? If someone gives you a risk assessment, have a look at the first 3 risks, and if you can't see those 4 elements in each of those 3 risks, give it back to them and just say, go away and do this again. Because somewhere, without having that clarity there, you're not going to get a good result out of it. And do that with your own too before you give it to the boss. In the framework that this is kind of fitting in, when we try to fit everything into one model, as you do, right? Again, this is still fitting in with the ISO 31000. It's fitting with bow tie, where we're looking at likelihood management on the left, consequence management on the right. Does anybody familiar with the ESRA app or the hierarchy of controls? Yeah, no, either no one does or no one's game to put their hand up. Okay, so most of my best work has been somebody else's. I pinched this one from health and safety. And if you think about, especially at the enterprise level, when you're trying to make some assessment about what you can afford versus what you want, if you can eliminate the risk, that's much better. And this is going down a hierarchy of controls. So substitute the risk is better, isolate it. Engineering controls are better than administrative controls. Now, if you think about it in a practical point of view, simple example, I'll give you 2. Cleaning an oven. If you get a self-cleaning oven, or don't use the oven at all, you eliminate the risk. You can substitute the risk for cooking on a frying pan instead of an oven. You wouldn't have to clean the oven because you don't use it. You can isolate it, so if you do have to clean the oven, you do it where there's nobody else around who could be splashed by chemicals. You can think about an engineering solution where the oven cleans itself. We've heard of self-cleaning ovens. I don't know how well they work, frankly. Administrative controls where you teach people how to clean an oven safely and you look at using, maybe you've substituted chemicals. And then eyeglasses, personal protective equipment. Now, an information model, this works exactly the same way. So if you think I've got some valuable client data, national secrets, whatever it is, if you can eliminate the need for that, just shred it, delete it, and then go to open source material, that eliminates the risk straight away. It's gone. That's your first line of treatment. If you can do that, brilliant. If you can't, then substitute it. As I say, go to open source would be a good substitute, sensitive or secure or whatever it is, material for stuff that's maybe not quite as sensitive or available. And if you can't do that, then you can isolate it. Don't let everybody put it in their laptop. Don't spread it across 20 different offices. Put it on one server, put it in one secure room, isolate it where you can protect it. Engineering control. In the paper example, it's simple about lockable containers and an ICT space. You're thinking about, can you upgrade the security with putting, for example, just all sorts of high DZs, demilitarized zones. You can put it into a different environment potentially. Administrative controls, who has access, who's got, do you do logical checks? Do you actually do audits? Do you take people's access when they go away? Do you train them how to manage it and have access to it? And last but not least, you think about the equivalent of personal protective equipment, That's eyeglasses if you're cleaning oven, that's a bulletproof vest if you're working in a war zone. In this situation, that's putting it on encrypted thumb drives. So you protect it down to the point where it's mobile. You can do the same thing with paper for that matter. The personal protective equipment for a paper file means putting it into a jacket with top secret or whatever written on the cover. So if someone does walk past it and they see it, okay, well, I know this shouldn't be here. I've got another layer of protection to put it away. It's not as good as locking that paper up in a steel cabinet, and likewise having an encrypted thumb drive is definitely not as good as shredding it and getting rid of it. But that whole EC app starts to think about how you frame controls, how you argue for the money to do it, and how you decide which one am I going to do. Now, gold standard, you do all of them, right? Okay. But in the real world, we don't get to do that. There's one other area I'll touch on, basically moving along the top there. That's equally, retain the risk, share the risk, change of consequence. So from left to right is better to worse. And I've seen a couple of people have said, we can transfer the risk. In my view, transferring risk is a really old idea. It's a really good idea. It just doesn't work. People will say, I've transferred the risk because I've outsourced that contract. Yeah, and when one of their insiders breaches your system or steals something from you, it turns out you didn't actually transfer it at all. You just maybe even increased it. I've insured the risk. I've passed that risk off to an insurance company, so I've transferred that. Well, firstly, most insurance companies will have an excess, so you'll still end up paying a bit of it. Secondly, there might be one or two insurance companies that have gone broke in history. Anybody had experience, an AIG or something like that, where you turn out, hey, I'm still holding this messy bundle of stuff that I really didn't want to. So ultimately, you're always sharing the risk. All right, that's a very quick view of a system that I use, whether it's in my head in terms of going through a very simple security risk assessment, or it's actually documented at each point for a complex one. So that model's up there, there's lots of stuff. Even if you just think about it, and you can find it in the original and the current still security risk management body of knowledge, but if you actually just sit down and look at each word there in detail and, dare I say it, make your own interpretation. But at least if you make an interpretation that's standard and everybody in the organisation has a shared understanding that you've got this process in place of some sort, and feel free if you use a different model, do that. Now I'm going to open for questions. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. I'll leave that back up there. For those of you who missed it, please send it to all your mates. I'm on a bit of a mission like ISC2 to improve the world. Okay, so I'm going to let the moderator here, Tom, pick a... As I say, I wear a lot of hats, so you can find me at a lot of email addresses.
Yeah, great presentation, by the way. Quick question.
Thanks.
So with the evolution of different types of technologies, like quantum computing, the metaverse, AI and ML,
Yep.
Do you see risk management kind of like morphing? How would you actually see risk management evolving in the next 10, 15 years? Do you think like the existence of these different types of frameworks, risk matrices would work 10, 15 years from now? Or do you think that they should evolve as well as technology evolves?
Great question. Come up and choose a book, thank you, if you'd like one. There, I know you've got to do the up in public sort of thing. So look, it's a great question because we are moving from one paradigm to the next. And the interesting thing about AI is, while it's a game changer, it's actually not as much as we think. There's a couple of reasons for that. Is, well, it'll sneak up on us before we have a chance to, but no, more realistically, I could drive from, let's say, Los Angeles to New York. An electric vehicle with an automated AI can drive faster, safer, smoother, more efficiently than I can do it. But that AI does not yet have a reason to go from New York to Los Angeles. So my greatest fear with AI is that, for the near future at least, is that it becomes weaponized. So it won't be a question of the AI turning against us in the next sort of few years. Well before that point, humans, let's pick North Korea, not to pick on anybody, not saying, but let's say you have a rogue state that actually develops a level of AI which is sufficient to be a serious threat for us. So that changes the game in terms of what happens, and the whole Internet of Things situation changes. You know, the attack surface, it changes the likelihood of it. But we also get to play defence, if you like, with AI. And at some point, we're already there. We've got black boxes, basically. We're running AI. We're saying, you know, Google's operating system, it's got an AI which is optimising their servers in the background. And that's exactly how we're going to start doing security, and we're going to be saying, AI, I want to go to the beach. Can you just, you know, manage our organisation for us and protect us? The problem is every AI builds the next generation of AI. So whoever gets a 6-month lead has a 12-month lead, and then they have a 2-year lead. And that's that exponential curve which is unpredictable. There's a whole other aspect around, I'll talk briefly about AI. AI is like any other entity. It's got to have a reason. There's only really 4 strategies that humans have used to pass on our DNA. And that is simply that you nurture your young, and you kind of nurture your land and you protect it. You destroy your aggressor, you basically kill all the other DNA, you kill the other tribe. You are an adventurer and you go to greener pastures, or where you can find new resources. So America and Australia are both founded by immigrants who are looking for greener pastures. You can see in Europe where they've had genocides, you know, Serbia, Croatia, even in Rwanda in Africa, where one tribe passes on the DNA by killing the others, and the others go, no, I'm going to stay here and nurture. If you think of AI in that space, and then there's another element around AI or humans, which is when you intersection of the aggressive, kill the other DNA off, and the adventurous, you end up with colonialism. So it doesn't really answer your question, but what it means is that there are certain things that AI are going to want to do which we don't know yet, but they've got to follow those 4 fundamental strategies to survive, and they don't yet have a reason to drive from New York to Los Angeles. But thank you. Do we have more questions? Sorry, the people at home, I do have a book for you. You can download it.
So a question, if you can comment a little bit about what happens after the risk assessment is done. So you brought in somebody, they deliver a report. What's your advice or thoughts on getting management to do something with that assessment?
So getting to the nitty-gritty. So there are a couple of things with that. Firstly, I like to set the field as part of the process. So, you know, if, for example, if I ask you to not think about right now a group of armed terrorists burst in here like a Moscow siege, armed with assault weapons and IED vests and what have you. How many of you in here did think about that? And how many of you here started thinking about how would I react? You know, would I be the quiet person? Would I be the grey man? How many people looked at the exit, you know? Can I make it to that? So this is part of the whole questioning process of doing it, is try to bring people on the journey so you get them thinking about what needs to happen, you get them already engaged. There's another aspect I do, which is I separate the risk assessment from the treatment plan. Partly because they can be quite big documents, and each treatment tends to be at least a page in that. I mean, the defence one I did is probably the biggest out of them all. that worked out to about $300 million worth of treatment plans, of which about 150, 180 were already in play, and I joined their existing projects into that treatment plan. So they had an identity management process they were doing at the time, and I said, let's put that in there so that the Chief of Defence Force can look at it and say, right, now I can defend this project because I've got a risk assessment which is classified, and I've got a risk treatment plan which is essentially official sensitive. I can give that to anybody now who needs to implement it, and I've already got in the stuff that people signed off on. So it's that ability to share it as widely as possible, because if you put one in place that's too secret, you don't want to tell everybody what your vulnerabilities are, so lock that risk assessment up. But give them the treatment plan and say, like this, do that, you've all agreed. There's a whole lot of other tricks. One thing, get them in a room with a data projector and work out, and don't let them leave the room until they've signed it. That's one thing I do.
So, Julian, we have a number of questions that have come in from our online audience. Let me ask you this one right here. What's the relationship between enterprise security risk assessments and board-approved security risk appetite statements? Do you feel this is well understood by most boards when setting risk appetite statements?
I've done a lot of enterprise security risk assessments, you might have gathered, right? And when I do them as a risk assessor, I think the process is really important and it's great. And then I became a CEO and a company director, and suddenly, and I know it's sacrilege to speak about, I didn't really care about the framework and the process. I know what I cared about as a CEO or a board member was the outcomes. I cared about the objectives, and as long as there was some rigor to it, it's just going to help me achieve my objectives. And part of that is saying, well, if I've got objectives, how much risk am I going to take? Now, there's a lot of models around this, but I'll give you an example of Amazon in terms of risk appetite. When Amazon was started, they were risk-seeking, like they were risk-crazy. We don't have much to lose. A typical startup has a huge risk appetite, like, okay, we don't want to get sued or killed, but other than that, we know we've got a 50% chance of blowing up anyway, so let's just hit it hard. And then they moved from that rule breaker stage to the rule taker, where they've actually got to meet compliance obligations. And that's a big part of risk appetite, where you're starting to say, oh, I can't really afford to go bust anymore. I've got a lot invested here. I've got a bit of, investors' money, legal liability, and a chance to make the gold hoop. So I'm now a rule taker. And then you go into the point where, again, Amazon and Facebook, maybe Facebook's not the best example given the size of the fines they're prepared to take from GDPR, but let's think about Amazon as a rule maker. They went from rule breaker, rule taker to rule maker. They now set the scene for the industry. So that part of security risk assessment, you've got to think about when you're communicating with the board, where are they on that journey? How much risk do they want to take? And unfortunately, you can't quantify most risk. You can't quantify for a board how much exposure you're prepared to take on the newspaper. Is that like 8.1 mentions per day in the national press? It's not quite that simple. You can do the money side of it, great. You can even do the number of lives lost, for military or engineering, but it really comes down to where they are on the journey. More questions?
We have additional ones online. Anyone have one in the room? Yeah.
We've got 6 minutes and 19 seconds left before lunch. And I won't feel bad if you're really hungry if you wanted to leave for lunch.
Yeah, thanks. It sounds like your approach is very ISO 31000 centric. Our shop is more NIST.
Yeah.
So is there a harmonization between those two? Or a way to take what we're doing with NIST and apply some of these controls? Because that latter is kind of a different concept.
It's a slightly different approach, and I actually have looked at trying to harmonise them and put something in that space. I think the two are complementary. So when you look at most of the NIST, it's really looking at saying, okay, what are the controls that I need to look at? What are the key areas of risk and how do I approach it? It's a good question. I don't have an easy answer for it. Shortly, there's no simple approach other than if you run with ISO 31000 as the assessment and NIST as your criteria, if you like, for want of a better word, your design space, then they can work together very well. And I need to write that book, you're right. Thanks. We actually have a system in Australia, the Information Security Manual, which has 700 different criteria, which does not bear any resemblance whatsoever to ISO 31000. So, and yet they still manage to work side by side.
Okay, here's a tricky one for you.
Okay.
Multilateral organizations are not constrained by country laws and regulations in many respects. How do you help such organizations measure and manage risks?
So multinationals, huh? It's very much in the board, that organisation has to really set the board risk appetite. How much risk do we want to take? What do we want to do with it? And the Irish tax laws, for example, are a classic where companies like Apple have said, we can reduce our costs, we can make more profit, we're going to take a bit of risk, we might get hit, they did in the end. But when you look at it, you've got to think, okay, it's an enterprise and it's about capability and objectives. So to drill it back down, like a simple example with the gas plant was, we said we can't stop it from being destroyed, but we can make sure we've got contracts in place to buy spot cargo so that our capability continues. So from a multinational point of view, you might say, well, it's high risk over there. It's not so high risk over there. What do we actually do in terms of promises to our customers? And that's the enterprise point of view, protecting that capability, not the assets, right? Forget the assets. The assets are down here. People are important, okay? We are, at least anyway, in this room. There's two types of blood when you're in an ambulance office. There's my blood and there's their blood. But the functions that those assets deliver are things like payroll, marketing, legal, all those sort of things. But what their functions are only there to support capability, and capability is only there to support objectives. So that's that. For a multinational, it actually doesn't change much as long as you can still deliver capability. Yeah. Any last questions? Anybody hungry? Yeah. Yes, I will actually put it, I've changed it a little bit since the upload was here, as you do, okay. But it's going to be up on my juliantalbot.com website within hours. and tell your friends, by the way, the books, I can only make them free for today, so if you like them, grab them. Thanks very much, everybody. Yeah.